G.I. Joe Retaliation kicks off with an intense covert operation deep inside the Korean demilitarized zone, where the team has been deployed to extract a North Korean defector. Under the cover of darkness, Roadblock leads the entry, using specialized thermal gloves to slice through the border fence. Duke and Flint move in beside him, while the rest of the squad holds their positions, providing overwatch. Spotting the defector hiding inside a parked truck, Duke flashes a red signal to confirm his identity. Without wasting a second, he and Roadblock advance, silently eliminating two approaching soldiers before they can raise the alarm. Meanwhile, Flint breaks off and assaults a nearby guard tower. Roadblock, noticing Flint going off script, warns Mouse to take him out if things spiral out of control. But as the dust settles, Flint proves his move wasn't reckless. He secures the tower and proudly raises the G.I. Joe flag, signaling victory. Later that night, the team unwinds at a bar, blowing off steam with drinks and lighthearted competitions. But the mood shifts when Roadblock calls out Flint's earlier disobedience. In a rough but brotherly reprimand, he dunks Flint's head into a tub of water, holding him under just long enough to make his point clear: orders are not optional. We then learn that after the Nanomite War, Duke has stepped up as the new leader of the G.I. Joes. His team includes Flint, Roadblock, Mouse, Lady J, and the silent but deadly Snake Eyes. Their biggest enemies, Cobra Commander and Destro, are locked away, but not all threats have been neutralized. Storm Shadow and Zartan are still out there, moving in the shadows. Across the world in Japan, Storm Shadow's cousin, Jinx, undergoes a brutal test inside a traditional dojo. Under the watch of her blind master, she must face Snake Eyes in combat, while he fights blindfolded. Armed with her blades, Jinx stalks him through the wooden halls, eventually landing a strike that cuts his palm. But Snake Eyes quickly adapts. Using a drop of his own blood as a distraction, he misleads her long enough to grab a strand of her hair, securing victory. Frustrated, Jinx storms out, while the master presents Snake Eyes with a sword and sends him on a mission to investigate whispers of an impending attack. Back in the United States, Duke and Roadblock are relaxing at home, locked in a video game match. Their downtime is interrupted when the news cuts in with breaking coverage. Pakistan has descended into chaos following the assassination of its president, sparking a violent civil conflict. At the White House, the president meets with his cabinet to determine a response. With nuclear weapons potentially at risk of falling into the wrong hands, he authorizes military intervention. The mission is clear: secure Pakistan's nuclear arsenal before it's too late. The task is handed to the G.I. Joes. Aboard their aircraft, the team pinpoints the location of a nuclear warhead. Duke briefs everyone. Roadblock will lead the ground assault, while Flint and Lady J provide tactical support. As soon as they deploy, the operation turns into a full-scale firefight. Bullets fly as the Joes cut through enemy forces with precision and speed. Duke pushes forward under heavy resistance, fighting his way toward the warhead. Flint and Lady J cover him, taking down threats from all sides. Against the odds, they secure the nuke and extract it from the compound, transporting it safely back to their temporary base. Once there, Duke reports directly to the presidential cabinet, confirming mission success with 0 casualties. The mood shifts to relief and celebration as preparations begin for extraction. To pass the time, Duke and Roadblock engage in a friendly wager. If Duke wins a shooting challenge, Roadblock accepts his next promotion. But if Roadblock wins, Duke has to babysit his daughters. Duke lines up his shot, but Roadblock distracts him at the last second, causing him to miss. Then Roadblock steps up and completely obliterates the target using a minigun, securing his victory in spectacular fashion. But far from the battlefield, something far more sinister is unfolding. At the White House, the president retreats to a private shed with his bodyguard, only to reveal his true identity. It's not the president at all, but Zartan, disguised using advanced nanomite technology. The real president is being held captive, guarded by operatives loyal to Cobra. Zartan makes his intentions clear. He has already set the stage to eliminate the G.I. Joes, clearing the path for his larger plan. He demands the location of Cobra Commander and Destro, but the real president refuses to cooperate. Back at the Joes camp, extraction is finally underway. A helicopter approaches, but instead of rescue, it unleashes a sudden barrage of missiles. Explosions rip through the base, throwing everything into chaos. Flint is knocked to the ground, dazed and exposed. Without hesitation, Duke rushes back into the danger, dragging him toward cover. Just as they think they're safe, another chopper locks onto their position. In a final act of sacrifice, Duke shoves Flint out of harm's way, but is caught in the blast himself, losing his life in the explosion. The rest of the team is wiped out in the devastating assault. Amid the destruction, Roadblock, Lady J, and Flint make a desperate escape, diving into a nearby well. Submerged beneath the water, they hold their breath as enemy forces sweep the area, narrowly avoiding detection. The following morning, they emerge to a grim reality. Their entire unit has been reduced to rubble. Back in Washington, Zartan addresses the nation, spinning a web of lies. He declares that the G.I. Joes have gone rogue, accusing Snake Eyes of assassinating Pakistan's president and claiming the team stole a nuclear weapon. Using this fabricated narrative, he announces the deployment of Cobra forces to hunt them down. Standing among the ashes of their fallen comrades, Roadblock picks up Duke's dog tags, silently accepting the weight of leadership. With no backup and nowhere to turn, he decides their only option is to move east and regroup. Elsewhere, Snake Eyes arrives at the heavily fortified Eisenstern prison. The facility's warden, James, greets him and escorts him deep underground. Inside, two infamous prisoners, Destro and Cobra Commander, are suspended in tanks, immobilized but still conscious. When the guards remove Snake Eyes' helmet, the truth is revealed. It's not him at all, but Storm Shadow in disguise. The warden doesn't question it. To him, a high-value prisoner is all that matters. Meanwhile, far from civilization, the surviving Joes push forward through the harsh terrain of the Indus Valley Desert, beginning their fight for survival. Flint pushes the idea of reaching out to headquarters, hoping there's still someone they can trust. But Roadblock shuts it down immediately. From his perspective, the entire operation was a setup, possibly orchestrated from the very top. Whoever is pulling the strings has already painted them as traitors, so reaching out would only expose them further. For now, they stay off the grid and rely on the only ally they still believe in, Snake Eyes. Deep inside the high-security prison, Storm Shadow is confined within a containment tank. Not far away, a Cobra agent discreetly releases a swarm of nanomites into the system. These microscopic machines make their way into the facility, triggering a chain reaction. Inside his tank, Storm Shadow suddenly appears to go into cardiac arrest. As the guards rush in and open the chamber, he springs into action, swiftly taking them down and breaking free. Within moments, the prison erupts into chaos. Explosions rip through the structure, part of a coordinated assault led by Firefly, sending debris flying and security into disarray. Using the confusion, Storm Shadow locates Cobra Commander and frees him from his suspended state. Destro remains behind, left to his fate, as Cobra Commander chooses not to waste time on him. Storm Shadow, still severely injured, is evacuated to a remote mountain location to recover. Meanwhile, Snake Eyes watches as a helicopter lifts off from the prison, carrying the escapees away. Jinx soon joins him, offering her assistance in tracking Storm Shadow down. Their paths now aligned, they set off together. Cobra Commander reunites with Zartan and Firefly at a hidden base, where a massive project is already underway, a devastating weapon known as Zeus. When he's informed that 3 members of the G.I. Joes survived the ambush, he orders their immediate elimination. Firefly eagerly volunteers to handle it personally. Elsewhere, the surviving Joes make their way to Roadblock's hometown, seeking refuge with a trusted friend who offers them a safe place to regroup. With limited resources, they begin piecing together what went wrong, focusing especially on the president's increasingly suspicious actions. High in the mountains, Storm Shadow slowly recovers inside a secluded monastery. But he's not alone for long. Snake Eyes and Jinx are already on his trail. During this time, they receive a message from Lady J, who has begun to suspect that the man acting as president isn't who he claims to be. Subtle changes in behavior have raised red flags. Determined to dig deeper, Roadblock brings the team to meet General Colton, the original Joe, who provides crucial intelligence regarding the president's chief of staff. Acting on this lead, Lady J later infiltrates his world, using charm and deception to get close. She lures him into a car, where the team captures and interrogates him, forcing him to place a call that could expose the truth behind the president's identity. At the same time, Snake Eyes and Jinx finally reach the monastery. Storm Shadow, now recovered and preparing to leave, notices a guard being hurled down the mountain. Realizing danger has arrived, he arms himself and steps out to face Snake Eyes. The confrontation is immediate. Storm Shadow launches a shuriken, but Snake Eyes counters by shooting it midair, setting off a fierce and relentless duel. Their fight rages back and forth, each gaining ground before losing it again. Inside the monastery, Jinx encounters the woman who had been caring for Storm Shadow. A brutal fight breaks out between them, ending with Jinx knocking her opponent unconscious. Outside, the battle between Snake Eyes and Storm Shadow spills onto a narrow mountain ledge. Storm Shadow gains the upper hand, pinning Snake Eyes down. But just as he's about to finish it, Jinx intervenes, deploying a gas device that knocks him unconscious. They quickly secure Storm Shadow in a body bag, but before they can escape, enemy soldiers close in from all directions. With no time to spare, Snake Eyes sends the body down the mountainside via zipline, while he and Jinx descend using grappling hooks. The enemies intercept the body midline and anchor it to the cliffside, forcing a high-risk confrontation. What follows is a gravity-defying sword fight along the vertical rock face, blades clashing as both sides battle for control. In a final move, Snake Eyes draws the soldiers onto a ledge beneath a massive glacier. With precise timing, he fires a shot that destabilizes it, triggering a powerful avalanche. Snow and ice thunder down the mountain, sweeping the enemies away. Against all odds, Snake Eyes survives the collapse, and the body remains intact. Elsewhere, Lady J executes another bold move, infiltrating a high-profile event hosted for the president. Disguised as a reporter, she signals Roadblock and Flint, who wait nearby. Inside, she maneuvers through the crowd, carefully catching Zartan's attention. As she plays along, Zartan's bodyguard begins verifying her identity through security systems. Despite the risk, she successfully draws Zartan in. He invites her to dance, but she declines, using the moment instead to discreetly collect a strand of hair from his jacket. She places it into a handheld scanner, and the results confirm her suspicion. This is not the real president. At the same time, the bodyguard realizes who she truly is, but before he can act, Lady J escapes. Outside, as she makes her getaway, Roadblock sees his chance. Consumed by anger and grief over Duke's death, he decides to take out Zartan then and there. As Zartan approaches his car, Lady J and Flint try to stop Roadblock, warning him it's too risky, but he pushes forward anyway. Suddenly, Firefly intervenes, unleashing nanomite attacks that force Roadblock into a brutal hand-to-hand fight. The two exchange heavy blows, with Roadblock initially gaining the advantage. But Firefly turns the tide, grabbing a metal rod and striking him down repeatedly. Just as Firefly prepares to finish him, Lady J and Flint crash their car into him, disrupting the attack. Even so, Firefly manages to escape, speeding off on his bike. Elsewhere, Storm Shadow faces execution, forced to confront his past. He is presented with a sword, the very weapon said to have been used in the murder of his master during his childhood. But as the blade strikes, it shatters, proving it's a fake. In that moment, the truth becomes clear to him. He realizes he was framed, and the one responsible was Zartan, who had disguised himself as his master all those years ago. Back with the team, Flint confronts Roadblock over his reckless actions, frustrated by the unnecessary risk. But Roadblock refuses to back down, standing firm in his decision before walking away in anger. Later, Lady J opens up to Flint, sharing a personal story. She reveals that she joined the army to prove her father wrong, a man who believed she'd never rise above him. Her goal was to outrank him, but he passed away before she could achieve it. At the White House, Cobra Commander makes his move. Forcing the real president to comply, he uses a retinal scan to gain control of the United States nuclear arsenal. Meanwhile, at their hideout, the Joes gather for a quiet meal, discussing what Cobra Commander's endgame might be. Given everything they've uncovered, they conclude that nuclear weapons must be central to his plan, especially with Zartan organizing a global summit involving nuclear powers. Just then, unexpected allies arrive. Snake Eyes, Jinx, and Storm Shadow walk in. Flint is immediately wary, unable to fully trust Storm Shadow, but despite his doubts, he accepts the uneasy alliance, because Storm Shadow holds critical knowledge about Cobra Commander's plan. The entire team regroups at General Colton's home, where they prepare for what could be their final mission. Colton opens up his personal weapons cache, giving the Joes access to a wide range of firepower. To strengthen their chances, he also calls in a few trusted allies of his own to join the operation. As night falls, Roadblock lays out the strategy. Every role is assigned with precision. Colton and his team will secure the outer perimeter. Flint, Lady J, and Snake Eyes will move along the flanks, cutting through resistance from the sides. Meanwhile, Jinx and Storm Shadow are tasked with infiltrating as the Trojan horse, getting as close to the target as possible from within. Roadblock takes on the most dangerous responsibility himself, neutralizing the tanks guarding the area. He makes one thing absolutely clear. The briefcase in Zartan's possession is the key to everything. Since Storm Shadow will be closest to him, retrieving it becomes their highest priority. When Roadblock asks Colton for input, the veteran offers little adjustment, except that Lady J should stay close to his unit for added support. By the next morning, world leaders representing nuclear powers arrive at Fort Sumter in South Carolina, where a high-stakes summit is about to begin. The security presence is overwhelming, and media outlets around the globe are calling it a historic moment, expecting major diplomatic breakthroughs. But the atmosphere shifts instantly. Cobra Commander and Storm Shadow arrive at the fort with their forces just as Zartan begins the proceedings. Instead of diplomacy, Zartan abruptly cuts off all discussion and delivers a shocking ultimatum. Every nation must dismantle its nuclear arsenal immediately or face war from the United States. To prove he isn't bluffing, he opens a briefcase and launches several nuclear missiles. Panic spreads among the leaders as the threat becomes very real. At the same time, the Joes move into position, silently eliminating guards across the compound. Inside, under immense pressure, the world leaders are forced to follow Zartan's command and initiate the launch of their own nuclear weapons. Then in a twist, Zartan detonates his missiles mid-flight, demonstrating control and forcing the other nations to do the same. One by one, they self-destruct their arsenals. Within moments, the world is stripped of its nuclear weapons. But that was only the beginning. Zartan unveils Cobra's true weapon, Zeus, a satellite-based system capable of dropping massive tungsten rods from orbit, striking targets with devastating speed and precision, without nuclear fallout. Before the demonstration can fully unfold, Cobra Commander makes a dramatic entrance. Without hesitation, he orders a strike. A Zeus projectile is launched toward London, slamming into the city with catastrophic force, leveling large sections in seconds. With the world now at his mercy, Cobra Commander declares dominance. Cobra flags are raised over the White House, and Zeus satellites are positioned above key nations. His message is simple: submit or face annihilation. That's when the counterattack begins. Storm Shadow makes the first move from within, striking Cobra forces from the inside. Jinx and Snake Eyes immediately join him, cutting through soldiers with speed and precision. Amid the chaos, Zartan slips away, clutching the briefcase. Outside the fort, Roadblock charges into battle in a heavily modified vehicle, smashing through defenses. Tanks fire at him, but he maneuvers with surprising agility, returning fire and destroying them one by one. Inside, Jinx focuses on evacuating the world leaders, guiding them safely out of the building. Meanwhile, Snake Eyes and Storm Shadow continue their assault on Cobra troops. Storm Shadow then breaks away, pursuing Zartan with Snake Eyes' sword in hand. Snake Eyes remains behind to assist Jinx in securing the corridors. The chase leads Storm Shadow into a flooded chamber, where Zartan attempts to escape. After dispatching Zartan's last remaining guard, Storm Shadow corners him and presses the blade to his throat. But before he can finish it, a nanomite device flies in and detonates, engulfing both of them in the explosion. In the aftermath, Firefly calmly steps in, retrieves the briefcase, and disappears without hesitation. Elsewhere at the White House, Lady J and Colton begin their own operation, systematically taking out guards. The head of security grows suspicious and sends someone to investigate the basement entrance. Suddenly, a body comes tumbling down the stairs. As the guards aim, it's revealed to be Colton, playing dead. Using the element of surprise, he quickly eliminates them. Together, Colton and Lady J push deeper into the facility, reaching the holding area where the real president is being kept hostage. To create an opening, Lady J shoots the president in the arm, forcing him to drop and exposing the head of security. Gunfire erupts, and the man is killed, allowing them to free the president at last. Back at the fort, the fight isn't over. Zartan, still alive, confronts Storm Shadow and holds him at gunpoint. But in a split-second move, Storm Shadow deflects the bullet with his sword and launches the blade forward, piercing Zartan through the chest and ending him once and for all. In the courtyard, Jinx, Snake Eyes, and Flint finish clearing out the remaining Cobra forces. However, Firefly manages to slip away again, while Cobra Commander orders his satellite operators to prepare for another strike before boarding a helicopter to escape. Flint alerts Roadblock that Firefly is fleeing. Without hesitation, Roadblock abandons his disabled vehicle and spots Firefly racing off on a motorcycle. Pulling out his minigun, he fires, destroying the bike and forcing Firefly to continue on foot. The chase continues to the docks, where Firefly boards a boat in a last attempt to escape. Roadblock fights his way through multiple guards, then pursues him using another boat equipped with heavy weaponry. He opens fire, disabling Firefly's vessel before crashing into it and completely wrecking it. Both men wash ashore, where the final confrontation takes place. Roadblock overpowers Firefly, locking him into a chokehold until he finally loses consciousness. The briefcase is recovered. With only seconds to spare, Roadblock uses it to cancel the Zeus satellite launches. The weapons overload and detonate within their own systems, eliminating the threat once and for all. As Roadblock walks away, Firefly regains consciousness and attempts one final attack using a nanomite explosive. But to his shock, the detonator is already in Roadblock's hand. Without hesitation, Roadblock activates it, ending Firefly for good. Elsewhere, Storm Shadow survives and returns Snake Eyes' sword to him. In a symbolic gesture, Snake Eyes then passes the weapon to Jinx, officially recognizing her as part of the team. In the aftermath, the surviving Joes are honored by the president for their bravery and sacrifice. Jinx is formally welcomed into their ranks, while Colton presents Roadblock with his personal firearm, entrusting him with the responsibility of one day bringing Cobra Commander to justice. When a sequel arrives after a film that split audiences the way G.I. Joe, The Rise of Cobra did, there's always one big question hanging over it. Does it evolve, or does it just repeat G.I. Joe? Retaliation steps in with the clear intention of recalibrating the franchise. You can feel it almost immediately. This isn't just a continuation, it's a response, a reaction to criticism. A course correction designed to pull the series closer to what fans wanted in the first place. The tone shifts, the cast reshuffles, and the film leans into a slightly more grounded, stripped-down approach compared to the louder, more chaotic energy of its predecessor. But here's where things get interesting. Even as it tries to redefine itself, Retaliation never fully detaches from what came before. It still carries the DNA of the first film, its over-the-top premise, its reliance on spectacle, its connection to a toy-based universe where realism is optional at best. The result is a sequel that exists in a strange in-between space. It wants to be taken a bit more seriously, yet it's built on foundations that were never designed for that kind of weight, and that tension runs throughout the entire film. For some viewers, this shift works. There's a sense that the sequel is more focused, more streamlined, even more respectful to the source material. It feels like an attempt to bring the franchise closer to its roots, less glossy excess, more direct action, more emphasis on the team dynamic. In that sense, Retaliation can come across as an improvement, even a redemption. But for others, that same shift creates a different problem. By dialing back some of the first film's playful absurdity, the sequel loses a bit of what made it easy to enjoy in the first place. The original film, for all its flaws, committed fully to its identity. It was loud, ridiculous, and unapologetically fun. Retaliation, on the other hand, feels more conflicted. Not quite serious enough to feel grounded, but not wild enough to fully embrace its own chaos. It's a balancing act that never quite settles, and then there's the question of continuity. Technically, this is a direct sequel, but the way it handles returning elements can feel uneven. Some threads are carried forward, others are quietly dropped, and the overall connection to the first film feels more functional than organic. It's as if the movie wants the benefit of being a sequel without fully committing to everything that came before, which leads to an unexpected outcome. You don't necessarily need to have seen the first film to follow what's happening here. The story resets just enough to stand on its own, but at the same time, if you have seen the original, you might find yourself questioning what was kept, what was changed, and why certain elements feel disconnected. In the end, G.I. Joe, Retaliation isn't just a sequel, it's a franchise trying to redefine itself mid-flight. It improves in some areas, retreats in others, and ultimately lands somewhere in the middle. Not a complete reinvention, not a complete continuation, but something in between. A film caught between honoring its past and trying to fix it. And whether that works or not depends entirely on what you wanted from this franchise in the first place. At its core, G.I. Joe, Retaliation builds its entire narrative on a simple but high-stakes idea: what happens when the people meant to protect the world are suddenly erased from it. The film opens by establishing a devastating shift in power. The G.I. Joe team, elite, trusted, and seemingly untouchable, is blindsided. A coordinated strike wipes out most of the unit in an instant, leaving only a handful of survivors behind. And just like that, the balance is gone. The protectors are no longer in control of their targets. From that moment on, the story pivots into survival and retaliation. But this isn't just a revenge mission, it's something much larger unfolding in the background. Because while the Joes are being dismantled, Cobra is quietly executing a far more dangerous plan. At the center of it all is one of the film's defining concepts. The President of the United States isn't actually the president. Instead, he's an imposter. Through advanced disguise technology, Cobra places one of their own at the highest level of global power. It's a move that shifts the battlefield from open conflict to political manipulation. Decisions that affect the entire world are now being controlled from within, and no one suspects a thing. That's where the stakes escalate. With control of global leadership, Cobra begins steering events towards something even more extreme, leveraging nuclear weapons and international tension as tools of dominance. It's not just about power anymore. It's about control on a global scale, where entire nations become pieces in a much larger game. And the Joes, they're officially gone, branded, erased, and left with no support, no authority, and no resources. What remains is a small group of survivors trying to piece together what happened while staying alive long enough to fight back. So the mission becomes twofold. First, uncover the truth behind the attack and the fake president. Second, find a way to stop a plan that's already in motion. To do that, they're forced to reach backward, seeking out a figure from the past, someone connected to the original foundation of the Joes. It's a move that shifts the story from pure survival into regrouping, rebuilding, and preparing for a counterstrike. At the same time, the film introduces a parallel thread running alongside the main conflict, one rooted in personal history rather than global stakes. The ongoing tension between Storm Shadow and Snake Eyes unfolds in its own space, bringing a more focused, character-driven layer into an otherwise large-scale narrative. It doesn't always connect cleanly to the main plot, but it adds a different kind of energy, more physical, more stylized, and at times more compelling. And that dual structure defines the film. On one side, you have a global conspiracy involving political deception, military collapse, and large-scale threats. On the other, a more contained storyline driven by rivalry, identity, and unresolved past conflicts. Together, they create a story that constantly shifts between macro and micro, between saving the world and settling personal scores. But here's the thing. While the setup sounds massive, and it is, the way it unfolds doesn't always match the scale of its ideas. The film moves quickly, sometimes too quickly, pushing from one major development to the next without always grounding them in logic or clarity. The ambition is there, but the structure can feel scattered. Still, as a foundation, the premise does exactly what it needs to do. It creates urgency, it raises the stakes, and it gives the surviving Joes a clear reason to fight, because this time, it's not just about stopping a threat. It's about reclaiming control of a world that's already been taken from them. If there's one area where G.I. Joe, Retaliation sparks the most debate, it's here. How well does the story actually hold together? Because on the surface, the film moves with confidence. It jumps from one major event to the next, ambush, conspiracy, global threat, counterattack, with the kind of momentum you'd expect from a big-budget action movie. Things are always happening, the stakes are always escalating, but once you step back and start connecting the pieces, that momentum begins to feel a little unstable. The plot is built on big ideas, an imposter president, global manipulation, control over nuclear power, but the way those ideas are executed often feels thin. Developments happen quickly, sometimes too quickly, without the kind of grounding that makes them feel believable. Instead of unfolding naturally, the story often feels like it's being pushed forward simply because it needs to reach the next set piece. And that's where the cracks begin to show. There are moments where the logic behind the plan raises questions, not because the concept itself is impossible. This is a heightened, stylized world, but because the details don't always line up. You're asked to accept major shifts in power, major decisions, and major consequences, without always seeing the connective tissue that makes those shifts convincing. It creates a strange dynamic. On one hand, the film wants to present a more structured, more focused narrative than its predecessor. It leans slightly toward seriousness, toward a sense of real-world stakes. But on the other hand, the internal logic doesn't always support that tone. So instead of feeling grounded, the story can come across as inconsistent, caught between wanting credibility and relying on convenience. That inconsistency shows up in multiple ways. Certain plot threads are introduced and then left without resolution. Some character decisions feel underexplained. At times, it's not entirely clear how one event directly leads to the next. It just does. The film keeps moving, but not always with clarity. And then there's the issue of coherence. Despite having a relatively straightforward premise, the narrative can feel scattered. It shifts between different storylines, different characters, different locations, sometimes without giving each thread enough time to fully develop. The result isn't confusion in the sense that you can't follow what's happening, but more a feeling that everything is slightly disconnected. Like pieces that fit but not perfectly, even continuity raises questions. Elements from the previous film are carried over, but not always explained. Changes happen, returns happen, and the film doesn't always pause to justify them. It assumes you'll move along with it, and often, it's counting on the pace and spectacle to keep you from looking too closely. And that's really the key point. Retaliation isn't built as a story-first film. It's structured around moments, big reveals, action sequences, dramatic confrontations, and the narrative exists primarily to connect those moments together. When it works, you don't notice the gaps. When it doesn't, those gaps become impossible to ignore, so the screenplay ends up in a difficult position. It's not entirely chaotic. There is a structure, there is a direction, but it never fully locks into place. It feels like a draft that has all the right components, just not the cohesion to bring them together seamlessly. and ultimately that's what defines the experience. You can follow the story, you can understand the stakes. But whether it feels convincing, that's where the divide begins. Because G.I. Joe, Retaliation doesn't collapse under its own narrative, but it never quite stands firmly on it either. One of the most fascinating things about G.I. Joe. Retaliation isn't just what it shows, but how it presents itself. Because tone is where this film constantly shifts and sometimes struggles to decide exactly what it wants to be. On one side, you have a movie that's clearly built as a popcorn spectacle. It's loud, exaggerated, packed with larger-than-life concepts, and driven by action that doesn't care much about realism. This is a world where logic bends, physics takes a backseat, and the goal is simple: deliver excitement, keep things moving, and entertain. And when the film leans into that identity, it works. There's a certain honesty in those moments. A sense that the movie knows exactly what it is, a high-energy, toy-inspired action ride that isn't trying to be deep or complex. It embraces the chaos, the absurdity, the over-the-top nature of its own premise. And in doing so, it becomes easier to enjoy. But then it shifts, because Retaliation doesn't fully commit to being that kind of film. At times, it pulls itself into a more serious direction. The stakes are framed in global terms. The threat is presented with weight. The tone tightens, the humor steps back, and the film starts behaving as if it wants to be taken more seriously, more grounded, more intense. And that's where the imbalance starts to appear. Because the story itself isn't built for that level of seriousness. When a film asks to be taken seriously, it invites scrutiny. It makes the audience look closer, at the logic, the structure, the characters. And in those moments, the exaggerated nature of Retaliation becomes harder to ignore. What feels fun when treated lightly can feel questionable when treated seriously. So the film ends up caught between two identities. It's not fully playful enough to be carefree, tongue-in-cheek entertainment that laughs along with its own absurdity. But it's also not grounded enough to sustain the weight of a serious action thriller. Instead, it sits somewhere in the middle. And that middle ground is tricky, because when the film relaxes, when it allows itself to be cheesy, over the top, even a little ridiculous, it becomes easier to engage with. The flaws become part of the experience rather than distractions from it. The spectacle takes over, and the film delivers exactly what it promises. But when it tightens, when it tries to elevate itself into something more dramatic or realistic, that same spectacle starts to feel disconnected. The tone and the content stop aligning, and the film loses some of its natural rhythm. There's also a distinct sense of self-awareness, but it's inconsistent. At times, the movie feels like it understands its own ridiculousness. The dialogue, the one-liners, the exaggerated setups, they hint at a film that knows it's operating in heightened territory. But that awareness isn't sustained. It fades in and out, leaving the tone uneven. And that unevenness defines the experience. Because G.I. Joe, Retaliation isn't lacking identity, it has two. It just never fully chooses one. It wants to be a slick, serious action film. It wants to be a carefree, explosive spectacle. And in trying to be both, it never fully becomes either. Yet, despite that conflict, there's something undeniably watchable about it. Because even when the tone wavers, the intention is clear. This is meant to be an experience you feel more than analyze. A film you sit back with, let unfold, and accept on its own terms. So in the end, the question isn't whether the tone is perfect. It's whether you're willing to meet the film where it lives, somewhere between seriousness and spectacle, between intention and indulgence, between a movie trying to mean something and a movie that just wants to entertain. From the moment Joe Retaliation begins, it doesn't ease you in, it moves. The film launches straight into motion, quickly establishing its world, its conflict, and its characters without lingering for too long on any one detail. There's a constant sense that something is always happening. Missions, reveals, confrontations, scene after scene pushes forward with very little pause, and for many viewers, that pace is exactly what works. There's a momentum here that keeps the film alive. The story doesn't stall. The characters are always in motion, always reacting, always heading toward the next objective. It creates a rhythm where you're carried along by the energy of the film rather than asked to sit and analyze it. You're not given much time to question what's happening, because the movie has already moved on to something else. In that sense, Retaliation understands one of the core rules of blockbuster storytelling: keep the audience engaged through movement. But momentum on its own can be deceptive, because while the film moves quickly, that speed doesn't always translate into narrative strength. There's a noticeable difference between a story that flows and a story that rushes. At times, Retaliation feels like it's skipping over its own foundations. Major developments arrive and pass without fully settling. Transitions between events can feel abrupt. Characters shift from one situation to another without enough space for those moments to breathe. So even though the film never feels slow, it can feel thin. It's a kind of pacing where the surface is active, but the underlying structure isn't always reinforced. The movie gives you constant forward motion, but not always the clarity or depth to match that motion, and that creates an interesting contradiction. On one hand, the film feels efficient, lean, fast, and constantly progressing. On the other, it can feel fragmented, like a series of connected moments rather than a fully developed narrative journey. Even the length contributes to that feeling. Despite everything that happens, the film can come across as surprisingly brief. Not because it lacks content, but because it doesn't always allow that content to fully land. Scenes begin, deliver their purpose, and move on quickly, sometimes before their impact has time to register. And yet that same quality is also part of its appeal. For viewers looking for a straightforward, no-friction experience, this pacing works in the film's favor. There's no drag, no extended downtime, no prolonged exposition. It's direct. It's immediate, it keeps the energy high from beginning to end. The cast is constantly engaged. The story is constantly advancing. The film rarely stands still, but the trade-off is clear. In maintaining that momentum, the film sacrifices a level of cohesion. The narrative drive is powered more by progression than by connection. It moves forward because it needs to, not always because every step feels fully earned. And that's what defines the pacing of G.I. Joe, Retaliation. It's not slow, it's not stagnant, it never loses energy. But whether that energy feels purposeful or just continuous depends entirely on how much weight you expect each moment to carry. Because this is a film that chooses movement over reflection, and once it starts moving, it never really stops. If there's one thing G.I. Joe, Retaliation never holds back on its action. From start to finish, the film is built around spectacle. Explosions, firefights, hand-to-hand combat, high-tech weaponry, every form of large-scale action is on display. The movie doesn't just include action sequences, it runs on them. They are the engine, the structure, and in many ways, the entire identity of the film. And in terms of sheer scale, it delivers. The set pieces are big. The environments are expansive. The destruction is massive. Whether it's urban chaos, military confrontations, or stylized combat scenarios, the film consistently aims to create moments that feel larger than life. It wants to overwhelm you visually, to keep your attention locked through constant movement and impact. But scale alone isn't enough. What makes the conversation around this film so divided is not how much action there is, but how that action feels. Because on one side, there's a clear appreciation for the variety. The film doesn't rely on just one type of sequence. It shifts between different styles, gun battles, martial arts, tactical engagements, keeping things visually dynamic. Some sequences are fast and chaotic, others are more controlled and stylized. There's an attempt to give each major moment its own identity, and at its best, that approach works. There are moments where the action feels sharp, deliberate, even creative. Movements are readable. Impacts land with clarity. You can follow what's happening, understand where the characters are, and feel the rhythm of the sequence as it unfolds. In those moments, the film achieves exactly what it's aiming for: engagement through precision and flow. But that consistency doesn't always hold, because for every sequence that feels clear and purposeful, there are others that feel familiar. Repetitive, built from the same components you've seen countless times before. The gunfire blends together. The explosions start to lose their impact. The choreography becomes less about progression and more about filling space. And that's where the fatigue sets in. It's not that the action is poorly executed, it's that it can feel excessive without being imaginative enough to justify that excess. When every scene is trying to be intense, the intensity starts to level out. The film gives you more, but not always different. Clarity becomes another dividing line. At times, the action is easy to follow. The geography is clear, the movement is structured, and the sequence unfolds in a way that feels controlled. But in other moments, that clarity slips. Cuts come faster, framing becomes less precise, and the sense of space starts to blur. You're watching events unfold, but not always experiencing them with full awareness of how everything connects. So the film exists in a constant push and pull, between clarity and chaos, between variety and repetition, between impact and overload. And yet, even with those inconsistencies, the intent is undeniable. G.I. Joe. Retaliation is designed to keep you engaged through action above all else. It prioritizes movement over stillness, spectacle over subtlety, and immediacy over build-up. It doesn't want you waiting, it wants you reacting. Which leads to a simple reality. If you're watching for narrative depth, the action may feel like distraction. But if you're watching for energy, for movement, for pure cinematic momentum, this is where the film makes its strongest case. Because regardless of how you feel about its creativity or consistency, one thing is clear: G.I. Joe. Retaliation never stops trying to keep your eyes on the screen. In a film packed with explosions, gunfire, and large-scale chaos, there's one sequence that rises above everything else: the mountain. Because while G.I. Joe, Retaliation throws action at you constantly, this is the moment where it finally feels different. Set against a vast, icy cliffside, the sequence strips away the usual noise and replaces it with something more focused, more physical, more controlled, more visually distinct. Instead of relying on sheer destruction, it leans into movement, precision, space, and that shift matters. You're no longer watching anonymous firefights or interchangeable set pieces. You're watching bodies in motion, fighters navigating vertical terrain, suspended in open air, moving across the mountain like it's a stage. There's a rhythm to it, a kind of choreography that feels almost deliberate, almost artistic. At times it even resembles a performance: ropes cutting through the air, figures descending and ascending across the cliff face, blades clashing in tight, controlled bursts. The environment isn't just a backdrop, it becomes part of the action itself. Every movement is shaped by the height, the distance, the danger of the setting, and that's what gives the sequence its identity. It doesn't just look big, it feels designed. There's a clarity here that's often missing elsewhere in the film. You can track the movement, you understand the positioning, the geography makes sense, and because of that, every action carries more weight. You're not just watching chaos, you're watching a sequence unfold with intention. It's creative. It's visually striking, and most importantly, it's memorable. Even viewers who criticize the film as a whole tend to circle back to this moment, because it stands apart. It feels like the one place where the film pauses and says, "This is what we can do when we focus." But even this sequence isn't without its contradictions. For some, it goes on a little too long. For others, it feels disconnected from the main narrative, like a detour rather than an essential piece of the story. It's so distinct that it almost exists in its own space, separate from the rest of the film's rhythm. And yet that separation might be exactly why it works, because while much of Retaliation blends together, explosion into explosion, fight into fight, this sequence carves out its own identity. It doesn't rely on volume. It relies on execution, and in doing so, it becomes the film's defining moment, the one scene people remember, the one sequence that gets singled out, the one example of what the film could have been if that level of creativity had carried through the entire experience. In a movie driven by spectacle, this is the one moment where spectacle meets precision, and for a brief stretch of time, G.I. Joe, Retaliation stops feeling routine and starts feeling cinematic. If G.I. Joe, Retaliation has one undeniable strength on the surface, it's how big it looks. This is a film built on visual scale. From the very beginning, it leans heavily into CGI, digital environments, and large-scale destruction to create a sense of spectacle that constantly surrounds the story. Entire cities are threatened, landmarks are wiped out, technology operates far beyond anything grounded in reality, and visually, it can be impressive. There are moments where the film delivers exactly what modern blockbuster audiences expect: clean, polished effects that give weight to the action. The environments feel expansive, the destruction feels impactful, and the scale of what's happening is immediately clear. When the film commits to these large visual ideas, it creates images that are hard to ignore. You're not just watching action, you're watching scale. But as with many aspects of this film, that strength comes with a trade-off, because while the visual effects are often striking, they're also doing a lot of the heavy lifting. The film relies on them, not just to enhance the action, but to carry it. And when spectacle becomes the primary tool, everything else starts to feel secondary. The story becomes thinner, the tension becomes lighter. The impact becomes more visual than emotional, and that's where the divide begins. Some viewers see the effects as a major plus, a sign of a film that understands its role as a blockbuster. The destruction is bold, the imagery is ambitious, and the sheer scale creates a kind of cinematic intensity that's easy to enjoy. But others see something different. They see a film that hides behind its visuals. One that uses CGI to fill gaps where narrative depth or character engagement should be. Because no matter how impressive the destruction looks, it only resonates if there's something underneath it to give it meaning. Without that, it becomes spectacle for its own sake. There's also inconsistency in how these visuals are perceived. At times, the effects feel sharp and convincing, integrated into the world in a way that supports the action. But in other moments, they can feel less refined, less impactful, even slightly artificial. And when that illusion breaks, the scale that once felt immersive starts to feel distant. Like you're watching the idea of destruction, rather than experiencing it. And yet, the film never backs away from it. It continues to escalate, continues to expand, continues to push toward bigger and bigger visual moments. Entire environments are treated as expendable, cities become set pieces, global stakes are translated into digital spectacle, because at its core, G.I. Joe. Retaliation believes in one thing above all else: if it looks big enough, it will feel important. And sometimes that works. The imagery sticks, the sequences stand out, the scale creates its own kind of momentum. But at other times, that same approach highlights what's missing, because no matter how large the destruction becomes, it doesn't automatically create weight. It creates impact, but not always meaning. So what you're left with is a film that excels in visual ambition, but struggles to anchor that ambition in something deeper. It looks massive, it feels explosive, it delivers spectacle. But whether that spectacle truly lands depends on how much you need more than just what you see on the screen. When G.I. Joe, Retaliation shifts direction from its predecessor, that shift isn't just in tone or cast, it's in the hands behind the camera. This is where John M. Chu enters the picture, and his presence is felt almost immediately. There's a noticeable change in how the film moves, how it stages its action, and how it presents its world. Chu doesn't approach this as a purely chaotic spectacle. Instead, there are moments where you can see a more stylized, almost choreographed sensibility, especially in how movement is framed and how space is used. Nowhere is that more obvious than in the mountain sequence. That scene alone feels like a statement. It's controlled, deliberate, visually composed in a way that stands apart from the rest of the film. There's rhythm to it. A sense that the action isn't just happening, it's being designed. And that reflects a filmmaker who understands how to shape motion into something more than just noise. But here's the challenge: that level of control isn't consistent. Because while Chu clearly brings a distinct style to certain sequences, the film as a whole doesn't always feel unified under a single vision. It shifts between moments of creativity and stretches of more routine blockbuster execution. At times, it feels like two different approaches coexisting, one more stylized and deliberate, the other more functional and familiar, and that creates a kind of fragmentation. There are scenes where the direction elevates the material, where the action feels sharper, more intentional, more engaging. And then there are scenes where it falls back into standard patterns: quick cuts, generic staging, spectacle without distinction. It's not a lack of effort, it's a lack of consistency, because directing a film like this isn't just about creating standout moments, it's about maintaining a cohesive tone across everything, and that's where the film struggles. The pieces are there, the ability is there, but the overall execution doesn't always hold together as a single, unified approach. There's also the question of fit. Was Chu the right director for this kind of franchise? Some viewers see his involvement as a fresh perspective, someone willing to push certain sequences further, to experiment with style, to bring a different energy into a familiar formula. Others see a mismatch, an approach that works in isolated moments but doesn't fully align with the demands of a large-scale action franchise. And both interpretations exist within the film itself, because you can see what works. You can also see what doesn't fully connect. At times, Chu leans into the spectacle, embracing the scale and delivering exactly what the film promises. At other times, he seems to reach for something more controlled, more refined, only for that intention to get lost in the broader structure of the movie. So the direction ends up feeling uneven, not ineffective, not without vision, but not entirely cohesive either. It's a film that shows flashes of a director pushing boundaries and stretches where those boundaries aren't fully realized. And that's what defines John M. Chu's work here. There's style, there's ambition, there are moments of real creativity, but as a complete package, it never quite locks into a singular identity. Instead, it exists in pieces, some of them strong, some of them familiar, all held together by a film that's constantly trying to balance vision with expectation. And in that balance, you can see both the potential and the limitations of the direction behind G.I. Joe. Retaliation. At the center of G.I. Joe, Retaliation, beneath the explosions, the spectacle, and the shifting tone, there's the writing, the structure, the dialogue, the voice guiding how these characters speak, interact, and move through the story. And that voice comes from Rhett Reese and Paul Wernick, writers known for a very particular style: fast, energetic, often playful, and driven by character interaction as much as plot. You can feel that influence throughout the film. There are moments where the dialogue clicks. Exchanges between characters carry a sense of rhythm, quick, sharp, occasionally humorous. There's an effort to inject personality into the conversations, to give the film a lighter edge even in the middle of high-stakes situations. And when it works, it adds life. It creates brief pockets of energy where the characters feel more present, more engaged with each other. The banter flows, the tone loosens, and for a moment the film feels less mechanical, less like it's moving from event to event, and more like it's being carried by the people within it. But that consistency doesn't always hold, because alongside those moments, there's another side to the writing: lines that feel forced, jokes that don't quite land, dialogue that leans too heavily into cliché or exaggeration. Instead of enhancing the scene, it can pull you out of it, reminding you that you're watching something constructed rather than something unfolding naturally. And that contrast defines the screenplay. It swings between engaging and awkward, between lively and overly simplistic. There are stretches where the writing feels self-aware, even intentionally cheesy, and others where that same tone becomes unintentional, where the humor doesn't feel like a choice, but a misstep. The larger structure follows a similar pattern. The script clearly aims to balance multiple elements: action, humor, character interaction, and plot progression. It wants to keep things moving while also giving the audience moments to connect with the characters. But in trying to do both, it doesn't always give either side enough space. Scenes move quickly. Dialogue serves the moment, but not always the arc. And as a result, the writing can feel functional rather than fully developed, designed to support the action rather than stand alongside it. There's also a tonal challenge embedded in the script. Because the film itself sits between seriousness and spectacle, the dialogue has to navigate that same space. Sometimes it leans into humor, softening the intensity. Other times it tries to carry weight, to reinforce the stakes. But those shifts aren't always seamless. The transitions can feel uneven, as if the script is adjusting its voice from scene to scene. And yet, even with those inconsistencies, the intent is clear. This isn't writing that aims for depth, it aims for engagement. It's meant to keep things moving, to keep the tone accessible, to give the film a sense of personality within its larger framework. And in that sense, Rhett Reese and Paul Wernick bring exactly what you'd expect: energy, pace, and a willingness to lean into the film's more playful side. The question is whether that energy translates into consistency, because while the screenplay has moments that feel sharp and enjoyable, it never fully settles into a voice that carries the entire film. Instead, it fluctuates. Between humor and seriousness, between confidence and cliché, between lines that land and lines that linger for the wrong reasons, and that fluctuation becomes part of the experience, because in G.I. Joe Retaliation, the writing isn't invisible. You notice it, sometimes because it works, sometimes because it doesn't, but always because it's trying to find a tone that the film itself never fully locks into. One of the most noticeable and most defining shifts in G.I. Joe Retaliation happens before the story even fully settles in: the cast. Because this isn't just a sequel that continues where the last film left off, this is a franchise that actively reshapes itself. Characters disappear, faces change, roles are redefined, and what you're watching isn't just a continuation, it's a reconfiguration, almost like the series is rebuilding itself in real time. Compared to the first film, the lineup here feels dramatically altered. Several key players are gone, others are replaced, and the ones that remain are repositioned within a completely different dynamic. It creates a strange sense of familiarity and disconnect at the same time. You recognize the world, but not everyone in it. And that shift isn't subtle, it feels intentional. There's a clear sense that the franchise is trying to move away from what didn't work before, to reset expectations, to reshape its identity. And one of the fastest ways to do that is through the cast, but that approach comes with consequences. Because when characters disappear without much explanation, or are replaced without strong narrative justification, it starts to feel less like a natural evolution and more like a behind-the-scenes decision showing through on screen. You begin to notice the gaps, the absences, the sense that certain pieces were removed not because the story demanded it, but because something outside the story did, and that affects continuity. The film still connects to what came before, but that connection feels uneven. Some threads are carried forward, others are quietly abandoned. It creates a version of the story that exists in between, still tied to the original, but not fully committed to maintaining it. Almost like the franchise is choosing what to remember and what to forget. At the same time, this restructuring opens the door for something new, a new dynamic, a new balance, a new center of focus. With the old lineup largely gone, the film shifts its attention toward a smaller group of characters, redefining the team from the ground up. The hierarchy changes, the relationships change, and the tone of the group itself begins to feel different, less about a large ensemble, more about a tighter, more contained unit. For some viewers that works. It simplifies the narrative, it removes clutter. It gives the film a clearer direction moving forward. The franchise feels like it's trying to streamline itself, to focus on what it believes are its strongest elements. But for others, something is lost in that process. Because with so many changes happening at once, the film can feel unstable, like it hasn't fully settled into its new identity yet. The pieces are there, but they haven't completely locked into place. It's a transition more than a transformation, and that's really what defines this aspect of Retaliation. It's not just a sequel continuing a story. It's a franchise adjusting itself mid-course, trying to fix what didn't work, trying to build something stronger, trying to move forward without fully carrying everything from the past with it. And whether that works depends on how you see those changes. As necessary evolution, or as a disruption that breaks the continuity of what came before. Because in the end, G.I. Joe, Retaliation doesn't just tell a new story, it reshapes the world that story exists in. If there's one decision in G.I. Joe, Retaliation that feels deliberate, almost strategic, it's this: hand the franchise over to Dwayne Johnson. Because from the moment he steps into the center of the film, everything begins to shift around him. This isn't just a casting choice, it's a recalibration. Where the first film struggled with a lead that didn't fully anchor the story, Retaliation corrects that instantly. Johnson brings presence, confidence, a kind of natural authority that the film leans on heavily. He doesn't just occupy the role, he stabilizes it. And that stability matters, because this is a film that in many ways is constantly trying to hold itself together, through tone, through narrative, through structure. And right in the middle of that, Johnson becomes the one element that feels consistent. You believe him as the center. You follow him without question. You trust the film more simply because he's in it. As Roadblock, he carries the weight of leadership in a way that feels effortless. There's a physicality to his presence, but also a sense of control. He's not just reacting, he's guiding. And that gives the film something it desperately needs. A clear focal point, but what really defines his role here is how the film is built around him. The transition is unmistakable. The narrative shifts, the dynamic shifts, the energy shifts. It's as if the film recognizes that it needs a new center, and instead of gradually building toward it, it simply places Johnson there and lets everything else align. And to a large extent, it works. There's a charisma he brings that cuts through the film's inconsistencies. Even when the story feels thin or the structure feels uneven, his presence keeps things grounded, not in realism, but in engagement. You stay with the film because he gives you something to hold onto. There's also a sense of familiarity. By this point, Johnson had already established himself as someone who could step into existing franchises and inject them with new life. That same energy is present here. He doesn't reinvent the formula, he reinforces it. He gives it strength where it was lacking, but even that comes with a subtle limitation. Because while Johnson elevates the film, he can't completely transform it. The issues surrounding narrative, tone, and cohesion still exist. He doesn't erase those problems, he carries the film through them, and that distinction is important. He makes the film more watchable, more engaging, more confident, but he doesn't change what the film fundamentally is. Still, within the context of Retaliation, his impact is undeniable. This is no longer a film searching for a lead. It has one, a central figure who brings energy, presence, and a sense of direction to a franchise that needed all three. And in many ways, that's the role Dwayne Johnson plays here, not just as a character, but as a force within the film itself. Not just part of the story, but the reason the story holds together at all. One of the most surprising and most talked about decisions in G.I. Joe, Retaliation happens right at the start, and it revolves around Channing Tatum. Because on paper, his return suggests continuity, a familiar face, a direct link to the first film, someone who could carry the transition from one chapter to the next, but that expectation doesn't last long. Very early in the film, his character is removed from the story in a way that immediately reshapes everything that follows. What was positioned as a return quickly turns into an exit, and not a gradual one, but a sudden shift that changes the entire direction of the narrative. And that choice defines the film in ways that go beyond just one character, because for a brief moment at the beginning, there's something that works. The dynamic between Duke and Roadblock has energy. There's a sense of camaraderie, a balance between personalities that feels natural. It's one of the few times the film slows down just enough to let character interaction take the lead, and then it's gone. The film doesn't build on that foundation, it removes it. For some viewers, that decision feels abrupt, even jarring, not just because of the character itself, but because of what that character represents, a bridge between the two films. When that bridge disappears, the connection to the previous story becomes thinner, more fragmented. It reinforces the idea that this sequel isn't just continuing the narrative, it's reshaping it. There's also a sense that this decision exists beyond the story itself, that it reflects something happening behind the scenes as much as within the film. And when that kind of shift becomes visible, it can pull you out of the experience. You start to see the structure rather than just feel it, but at the same time, the film doesn't hesitate. It moves forward immediately. With Duke gone, the focus shifts, the leadership changes, the tone adjusts. And the narrative quickly recenters itself around a new core, pushing ahead as if this was always the intended direction. And in a way, That's what makes the decision so impactful. It's not just about removing a character, it's about redefining the film's identity in a single moment. For some, that works. It clears space. It allows the film to move in a different direction without being tied too closely to what came before. It accelerates the transition into something new. For others, it feels like a missed opportunity, because what was briefly established, chemistry, familiarity, continuity, never gets the chance to develop. It's introduced and then immediately taken away, and that leaves a question hanging over the rest of the film. What would this story have felt like if that connection had been allowed to continue? Instead, G.I. Joe. Retaliation makes a bold, definitive choice. It doesn't slowly evolve from the first film, it cuts away from it. And in doing so, Channing Tatum's role becomes something more than just a character arc. It becomes a turning point. A moment where the franchise decides to move forward by letting part of its past go. When G.I. Joe, Retaliation brings in Bruce Willis, it's not a subtle move, it's a statement. Because this isn't just another character entering the story, it's a legacy figure stepping into a franchise that's clearly trying to strengthen its identity, a familiar face, a recognizable presence. Someone whose very name carries weight before he even appears on screen, and the film knows it. From a distance, his role feels important. He's positioned as a foundational figure, a link to the origins of the Joes, someone with history, authority, and a connection to the past that gives the story a sense of depth. The idea is clear. Bring in a veteran, someone established, someone iconic, and let that presence elevate the film. But once you look closer, the reality becomes more complicated. Because while Bruce Willis is undeniably present, his actual function within the narrative is limited. He arrives later than expected. He stays for a relatively short time. And his role in the overall story remains surprisingly minimal. He's there, but not fully integrated. Instead, his presence operates on a different level. It's less about what he does in the story and more about what he represents. He brings with him a sense of legacy, a connection to the broader action genre, a kind of built-in credibility that the film can lean on without having to fully develop, and that creates an interesting dynamic. Because on one hand, there's enjoyment in seeing him. The familiar tone, the dry one-liners, the relaxed confidence, it all fits naturally within this kind of film. He doesn't need to do much to leave an impression. His presence alone carries a certain appeal. But on the other hand, that's also the limitation, because the film never fully commits to making him essential. He's introduced as someone significant, yet the narrative doesn't depend on him in a meaningful way. He contributes, he participates, but he doesn't drive the story forward. Remove him, and the structure of the film would remain largely the same. And that's where the disconnect lies. He's framed as important, but written as optional. There's also a sense that his role exists partially outside the story itself, that it's designed not just for narrative purposes, but for audience recognition, a way to enhance the film's appeal, to add another layer of star power to a franchise in transition. And again, the film is aware of this. It leans into his persona. The humor, the attitude, the self-aware edge, it's all there. Moments that feel less like character development and more like a nod to who he is as an icon within the genre. For some viewers, that's enough. It adds flavor. It adds familiarity. It gives the film a boost, even if it's brief. But for others, it feels underutilized. Because with a presence like Bruce Willis, there's an expectation, not just of recognition, but of impact. And when that impact doesn't fully materialize within the story, it leaves a sense of missed potential. In the end, his role in G.I. Joe, Retaliation, sits in a very specific space. He's not the heart of the film. He's not the driving force, he's not even essential to the plot, but he is presence, a legacy figure, a marketing asset, a familiar anchor in a film that's constantly shifting around him. And sometimes that's all the film needs. But it also makes you wonder what it could have been if that presence had been used for something more. For a film built around global stakes and large-scale conflict, everything ultimately comes down to one question: how strong is the opposition? In G.I. Joe, Retaliation, that opposition is Cobra, a name that carries weight within the franchise, a force that in theory should feel dangerous, calculated, and ever-present, and on a conceptual level it is. The idea of Cobra operating from within the highest level of global power, controlling leadership, shaping decisions, manipulating events from behind the scenes, is a strong foundation. It transforms the conflict from a straightforward battle into something more strategic, more deceptive, more far-reaching, but the execution tells a different story. Because while Cobra's plan is massive, its presence often feels fragmented. The leadership is split across multiple figures. Jonathan Pryce delivers a dual-layered performance tied to the fake president, arguably the most visible and consistent face of the villain's side. Arnold Vosloo operates within that same deception, reinforcing the idea of control through disguise. Meanwhile, Cobra Commander exists more as a symbol than a fully developed force, present but not always commanding the narrative. Then there's Firefly, portrayed by Ray Stevenson, a more physical, grounded threat, a character built for confrontation rather than strategy. Individually, these elements have potential. But collectively, they don't always come together as a unified force. And that's where the film's antagonists begin to feel less imposing than they should, because a strong villain presence isn't just about scale, it's about cohesion. It's about clarity of purpose, consistency of threat, and a sense that everything is working toward a single, focused objective. In Retaliation, that unity isn't always there. The pieces exist, but they don't always connect into something greater than the sum of their parts. There's also a noticeable shift from the first film. Some familiar antagonists are missing, others are replaced or reinterpreted. And while the franchise tries to maintain continuity, the villain's side ends up feeling partially reset, similar in concept, but different in execution. That change adds to the sense that the film is rebuilding itself, but it also creates a gap in presence. Because when villains change without strong narrative reinforcement, their impact can feel reduced. At times, Cobra feels powerful in theory, controlling governments, influencing global events, but less tangible in practice. The threat exists, but it doesn't always translate into consistent tension on screen. You understand what they're trying to do, but you don't always feel the weight of it moment to moment, and that distinction matters. Because in a film driven by action, the strength of the opposition defines the stakes. The more focused and present the antagonists feel, the more meaningful the conflict becomes. When that focus wavers, the scale remains, but the urgency fades. Still, there are moments where Cobra works. Moments where the concept aligns with the execution, where the idea of control, deception, and large-scale threat comes into focus. When those moments land, you see what the film is aiming for, a villain force that operates both in the shadows and in the open, shaping the world from above while engaging directly on the ground. But those moments aren't consistent. Instead, the antagonists in G.I. Joe, Retaliation exist in a fluctuating state, sometimes present, sometimes distant, sometimes unified, sometimes scattered, and that fluctuation defines their role in the film. Because Cobra isn't absent, it's just not always as dominant as the story needs it to be, which leaves the conflict feeling large in scale, but occasionally lighter in impact. And in a film where everything is built around confrontation, that absence of a fully unified villain presence is something you can't quite ignore. Amid all the explosions, shifting alliances, and large-scale chaos in G.I. Joe, Retaliation, there's one element that quietly holds the entire premise together: the president, or more accurately, the man pretending to be him, and at the center of that idea is Jonathan Pryce. Because while the film builds its stakes around global control and hidden manipulation, it's this performance that gives that concept a face, a voice, a presence that makes the idea of infiltration feel real, at least within the heightened reality of the film. What makes this role stand out is its duality. On the surface, you have the image of authority, calm, composed, controlled, the president as the world expects to see him, but beneath that there's something else, a layer of deception. A sense that every word, every decision, every public appearance is part of a much larger plan, and Pryce leans into that contrast. There's a subtle shift in how the character carries himself. A quiet awareness that what you're watching isn't quite what it seems. He doesn't overplay it. He doesn't turn it into something exaggerated. Instead, the performance sits right on the edge, just enough to suggest something is off, without breaking the illusion entirely. And that's what makes it effective, because the entire premise depends on that illusion holding. If the disguise feels weak, the concept collapses, but if it works even just enough, the stakes suddenly feel more grounded. The idea that control can come from within, that power can be taken not through force, but through substitution, that becomes the film's most interesting narrative angle. In many ways, this is where Retaliation comes closest to something more strategic. While much of the film operates through direct confrontation, this storyline introduces a different kind of tension. Not just action, but manipulation. Not just power, but influence. Decisions being made at the highest level, shaping events across the world without immediate resistance. And Pryce becomes the anchor for that. There's also a noticeable sense of enjoyment in the performance. He seems aware of the role's theatrical edge, the idea of playing both the symbol of authority and the force undermining it. And rather than grounding it completely, he allows that duality to come through. It adds a layer of personality to a role that could have easily been flat or purely functional. But even here, there are limits. Because while the concept is strong and the performance gives it shape, the film doesn't always build around it as much as it could. The idea of a fake president controlling global events is powerful, but it isn't always explored with the depth or consistency that it deserves. At times, it feels like a central pillar. At others, it becomes just another element in a much larger, more fragmented narrative, and that inconsistency holds it back from reaching its full potential. Still, within the film's structure, this remains one of its more memorable components. Not because it's the most explosive, not because it's the most action-driven, but because it's one of the few ideas that feels distinct, a concept rooted in deception rather than destruction. And at the center of it, Jonathan Pryce delivers exactly what the film needs, a performance that sells the illusion, just enough to make the entire premise hold together. In a film dominated by gunfire, explosions, and large-scale chaos, there's one thread that feels entirely different, quieter, more focused, more personal, the ninja subplot. Centered around Snake Eyes and Storm Shadow, this storyline runs parallel to the main narrative, but in many ways, it carries a completely different energy. Because while the central plot is about global threats and political manipulation, this arc is about something else entirely: history. Rivalry, identity. There's a sense that these characters exist on a different wavelength from the rest of the film. Their conflict isn't driven by world domination or military objectives, it's rooted in something more internal, something unresolved, and that gives their scenes a kind of weight that the broader narrative doesn't always achieve. You feel the tension differently, not through scale, but through connection, and that's part of what makes this subplot stand out. Visually, it brings a distinct style to the film. The combat shifts from chaotic firefights to controlled physical exchanges. Movement becomes precise. Every strike, every motion feels intentional. There's a discipline to it, a contrast to the more explosive, less structured action happening elsewhere. It's not just action, it's choreography, and at the center of it, Storm Shadow often becomes the standout presence. There's a magnetism to the character, an intensity that draws attention even in quieter moments. When he's on screen, the film feels more focused, more deliberate. Meanwhile, Snake Eyes brings a different kind of presence, silent, physical, defined more by movement than dialogue. Together, they create a dynamic that doesn't rely on exposition. It plays out through action, through confrontation, through shared history that the film hints at more than it explains. And that's where the strength and the limitation of this subplot begins to show. Because while it's one of the most engaging elements in the film, it doesn't always feel fully integrated into the main story. It runs alongside it, intersects at key moments, but never completely merges with the central narrative. At times, it feels almost like its own contained film, one with a clearer identity, but less connection to everything around it. There are also questions left unanswered. Certain developments, particularly involving Storm Shadow, arrive without the level of explanation you might expect. The film assumes familiarity, or simply moves forward without addressing those gaps. And while that doesn't necessarily break the experience, it does leave parts of the arc feeling incomplete. Still, even with those gaps, this subplot remains one of the film's strongest assets because it offers something different. A break from repetition, a shift in tone, a moment where the film feels more controlled, more intentional. It's where G.I. Joe, Retaliation steps away from pure spectacle and leans into something more stylized, something that feels crafted rather than assembled. And for many viewers, that's where the film is at its most compelling, not in the explosions, not in the scale, but in the silence between two characters who carry a story the film never fully tells, but never fully lets go of either. Beyond its shifting leads and central conflicts, G.I. Joe, Retaliation is built on an ensemble, a wide range of characters, each stepping in to fill a role within the larger machine of the film. Fighters, allies, antagonists, faces that come and go, contributing to the momentum even if they don't always leave a lasting mark. And that's really where the supporting cast sits, functional more than foundational. Because while the film surrounds itself with recognizable performers, the way it uses them is often limited. Characters are introduced, given moments, and then moved along as the story continues. There's rarely enough space for them to fully develop, which means their impact depends less on writing and more on presence. And that presence varies. Lee Byung-hun stands out as one of the more consistent highlights. There's a physical confidence to his performance, especially within the ninja-driven sequences, that gives his character a sense of control and identity. Even when the narrative doesn't fully support him, his screen presence carries through. Adrienne Palicki brings a steady energy to her role, contributing to the team dynamic in a way that feels natural within the film's structure. Her character is active, involved, and visually present throughout much of the story, but like many others, she isn't given the depth needed to move beyond that functional role. Then there's Ray Stevenson, whose role leans into a more traditional antagonist space. He delivers what's required: intensity, physicality, but the character itself doesn't offer much variation, leaving the performance feeling more like a familiar archetype than something distinct. Walton Goggins appears briefly, adding a flash of personality in a smaller role. It's a reminder of what the film occasionally touches on, moments where character energy stands out, but those moments are fleeting. And then there's RZA, a performance that draws attention, but not always in the way the film intends. In a cast already working with limited material, his presence feels particularly disconnected, highlighting how thin some of the character work really is. Which brings us to the larger pattern. Most of the supporting cast operates within narrow boundaries. They fulfill their purpose within the story, moving the plot forward, participating in action, delivering necessary dialogue, but rarely extend beyond that. There's little room for nuance, little opportunity for evolution. And because of that, many performances begin to blur together, not because the actors lack ability, but because the film doesn't give them enough to differentiate themselves. The characters exist more as roles within a structure than as individuals with distinct arcs. There's also a noticeable sense, at times, that some performances are running on autopilot, not disengaged, but not fully pushed either. It's as if the film doesn't demand more, so it doesn't receive more, and that's where the ensemble ultimately lands: capable, recognizable, occasionally engaging, but rarely essential. Because in a film so heavily driven by action and momentum, the supporting cast becomes part of the movement rather than the focus of it. They're there to support the pace, to fill the world, to keep things progressing. And while some moments break through, some performances stand out briefly, the overall impression remains the same. This is an ensemble that functions, but doesn't fully resonate. A group of characters who are present in the story, but not always remembered beyond it. In a film driven by action, power, and high-stakes conflict, the way characters are presented, especially female characters, says a lot about the priorities beneath the surface. And in G.I. Joe, Retaliation, this is an area where the film sends mixed signals. On one hand, the film positions its main female characters as capable, active members of the team. They're involved in missions, present in key moments, and treated, at least in dialogue, as equals within the group. There are explicit attempts to acknowledge their role, their skill, and their place alongside their male counterparts. But on the other hand, what the film shows doesn't always align with what it says, because visually, there's a recurring emphasis that shifts the focus. Moments that should reinforce strength or presence are often framed in a way that draws attention elsewhere, toward appearance rather than action, toward image rather than contribution. The camera lingers differently, the tone shifts subtly, and that contrast becomes hard to ignore. It creates a disconnect. Characters talk about respect and equality, but the presentation doesn't always fully support that idea. And that's where the tension lies, because this isn't a case of characters being absent or sidelined. They're clearly part of the story. They participate, they engage, they matter within the narrative structure. But the way they're framed at certain points can undercut that involvement, making their presence feel less grounded than it could have been. It's a balance the film doesn't quite maintain. At times, it moves toward a more restrained approach, toning down some of the excess that defined earlier entries. The characters are allowed to exist within the action, without being constantly reduced to visual emphasis. Those moments feel more aligned, more consistent with the film's attempt to reposition itself, but that consistency isn't sustained. The film occasionally falls back into familiar patterns, moments where visual framing contradicts narrative intention. And when that happens, it draws attention to itself, breaking the flow rather than supporting it. There's also a thematic layer beneath this, because the film includes dialogue that directly addresses the idea of recognition, of not being seen as equal, of having to prove value within a team dynamic. It acknowledges the issue, but doesn't always follow through on it in execution, which makes those moments feel incomplete, like the film is aware of the conversation, but not fully committed to resolving it. And that leaves the portrayal in a complicated space, not entirely regressive, not fully progressive, but somewhere in between, an attempt at balance that never fully stabilizes. In the end, the female characters in G.I. Joe Retaliation are present, capable, and involved, but the way they're presented doesn't always let them stand on equal footing with the narrative's intent. And that inconsistency becomes part of the film's larger pattern, a story that knows what it wants to say, but doesn't always say it the same way twice. In a film packed with high-stakes conflict and large-scale action, humor becomes more than just a bonus, it becomes a release valve. And in G.I. Joe Retaliation, that release comes through banter, quick exchanges, and the kind of one-liners that are meant to cut through tension just as quickly as the action builds it. You can feel this especially in the way characters interact. There's an effort to keep conversations lively, fast-paced dialogue, back-and-forth exchanges, moments where characters break the intensity with a line that's meant to land. either as humor, confidence, or just pure attitude. It's a familiar rhythm, one that's deeply rooted in action cinema, and when it works, it adds energy. It gives the film a sense of personality, a reminder that beneath the spectacle, there are characters reacting to what's happening around them. It softens the edges of the narrative, making the experience feel more accessible, more relaxed, even when the stakes are high. But that balance isn't always consistent, because humor in a film like this is all about timing and tone. Some lines land naturally. They feel like extensions of the characters, moments that fit the flow of the scene. The banter feels earned, the humor feels intentional, and the film benefits from that lighter touch. Other times, it doesn't land the same way. The dialogue can slip into something more forced, jokes that feel inserted rather than organic, one-liners that draw attention to themselves instead of blending into the moment. Instead of enhancing the scene, they interrupt it, breaking the rhythm rather than supporting it. And that's where the divide appears, because the film itself is already navigating a shifting tone, moving between seriousness and spectacle. The humor has to operate within that space, and when the tone isn't stable, the comedy isn't either. At times, the film leans into its lighter side, embracing the absurdity, allowing the humor to feel part of the experience. In those moments, the banter works. It complements the action, giving the film a sense of self-awareness. But in other moments, the film pulls back, trying to maintain a more serious tone while still delivering those same comedic beats. And that's where the disconnect happens. The humor feels out of place, as if it belongs to a different version of the film. Still, it remains a consistent presence. From small exchanges between teammates, to exaggerated lines delivered in the middle of chaos, to the occasional self-aware moment that acknowledges the film's own tone, the humor is always there. It just doesn't always land the same way, and that's ultimately what defines it. Not a failure, not a strength, but a fluctuating element, one that shifts with the film's tone, sometimes enhancing it, sometimes exposing its inconsistencies. Because in G.I. Joe, Retaliation, the humor isn't just about making you laugh, it's about keeping the film moving, keeping it light enough to enjoy even when everything around it is trying to feel serious. And whether that balance works or not depends entirely on how those moments land for you. In a film like G.I. Joe, Retaliation, where so much is driven by movement, scale, and visual intensity, the music plays a quieter but crucial role. It's not always the first thing you notice, but it's always there, shaping how everything feels. The score and soundtrack work as an undercurrent to the film's energy. They rise with the action, reinforce the rhythm of each sequence, and help bridge the transitions between scenes. When the film accelerates, the music follows. When it shifts tone, the sound adjusts with it. And in its strongest moments, that connection works. The music enhances the experience without overwhelming it. It supports the action, giving it weight and momentum. It fills the space between dialogue and spectacle, helping the film maintain its pace even when the narrative itself starts to thin out. There's a sense that the score understands what the film is trying to be, not subtle, not restrained, but immediate and impactful. It leans into that identity, amplifying the intensity of key moments, whether it's building tension before a confrontation or driving the energy of a large-scale sequence forward. And for some viewers, that's enough. The music does its job. It keeps the film moving, keeps the atmosphere consistent, and adds another layer to the overall experience. It blends into the structure in a way that feels natural, supporting rather than distracting. But at the same time, it rarely steps beyond that role, because while the score is effective, it isn't always distinctive. It doesn't consistently create moments that stand apart from the film itself. It doesn't linger in the mind once the scene ends. Instead, it operates within the background, present, functional, but not always memorable on its own. And that reflects the film as a whole. Everything is designed to work together in motion. The action drives the visuals drive the energy, and the music supports that energy without demanding attention. It's part of the system. There are moments where the soundtrack adds a bit more personality, where the tone shifts slightly, where the film feels more alive because of how sound and image come together. But those moments are brief. They enhance what's already there rather than redefine it, so the music ends up in a very specific space. It's effective but not defining. It's supportive but not central. It contributes without standing out. And in a film built on spectacle, that makes sense. Because G.I. Joe, Retaliation isn't asking you to focus on the music. It's asking you to feel the momentum. And the score exists to carry that momentum forward, quietly reinforcing every explosion, every movement, every shift in pace, without ever stepping into the spotlight itself. For all its scale, all its spectacle, and all its constant motion, G.I. Joe, Retaliation ultimately comes down to something much simpler. Do you care? because no matter how big the action is, no matter how high the stakes are, a film only truly connects when the audience feels something for the people at its center. And this is where Retaliation creates one of its biggest divides. For some viewers, there is a sense of engagement. The characters feel more defined than before, more present within the story. There's an attempt to give them clearer roles, stronger dynamics and moments, however brief, where personality comes through. You see glimpses of connection, moments of interaction that feel natural. Moments where the team dynamic comes into focus. Moments where the characters feel like more than just figures moving through action sequences. And when those moments land, the film becomes easier to invest in. But for others, that connection never fully forms, because while the characters are constantly present, they're not always developed. They move from scene to scene, from action to action, without enough depth to create lasting emotional weight. You understand who they are in function, but not always who they are beneath that function. And that distinction matters, because without that deeper layer, the stakes begin to feel distant. Events happen, conflicts unfold, losses occur. But the emotional impact doesn't always follow. The film gives you the structure of a story where you should feel something, but it doesn't always give you the foundation needed to actually feel it. The moments are there, but the connection isn't always built, and that leads to a strange experience. You're watching everything unfold, you're following the story, you're engaged on a surface level. But once it's over, it doesn't always stay with you. There's a lack of lasting impression, a sense that the film moves quickly through its emotional beats without fully grounding them. Characters come and go, relationships shift. But those shifts don't always carry the weight they're meant to, and yet it's not entirely empty. There are flashes, brief moments where the film almost breaks through, where a performance, a line, or an interaction gives you a glimpse of something more. Something that could have anchored the story more firmly, but those moments are isolated. They don't fully connect into a larger emotional arc, so what you're left with is a film that engages, but doesn't always resonate. It holds your attention while it's happening, it keeps you watching, it keeps you involved in the moment, but it doesn't always give you something to hold on to once the moment passes. On paper, G.I. Joe. Retaliation has everything it needs to feel intense. Global power is compromised, the world is under threat, entire cities stand on the edge of destruction, the stakes couldn't be higher. And yet, the experience doesn't always match that scale. Because tension isn't created by what's at risk, it's created by what you feel is at risk. And that's where the film begins to lose its grip. The story constantly tells you that everything matters, that the consequences are massive, that the outcome will affect the entire world, but it rarely slows down enough to let those stakes settle in. Events unfold quickly, decisions are made rapidly, and the film moves forward before the weight of those moments has time to register. So the danger feels distant. You understand it, but you don't always feel it. And that disconnect shows up throughout the film. Large-scale destruction is presented with visual intensity, but not always with emotional impact. Cities fall, threats escalate, and the consequences are framed as catastrophic, yet the narrative doesn't anchor those moments in something personal enough to make them resonate. It's spectacle without sustained pressure. Even the central conflict operates this way. The idea of global control, political manipulation, and nuclear escalation should create a constant sense of urgency. But instead of building that tension over time, the film introduces it, escalates it quickly, and then shifts focus, often before the full weight of the situation can take hold. So rather than tightening the story, it disperses it. The tension rises, then resets, then rises again without ever fully locking into place. There's also the issue of credibility. Because when the film leans into its more exaggerated elements, its larger-than-life scenarios, its extreme outcomes, it becomes harder for those stakes to feel grounded. The more implausible the situation becomes, the more the audience begins to step back rather than lean in, and once that distance forms, the tension weakens. It's no longer about what will happen, it's about how it will happen. The outcome feels inevitable, rather than uncertain. That said, there are moments where the film comes close. Moments where the scale, the pacing, and the situation align just enough to create a sense of urgency. Brief sequences where the stakes feel immediate, where the danger feels present rather than abstract. But those moments don't sustain. They appear, they pass, and the film returns to its broader rhythm of spectacle-driven progression. And that's what defines the dramatic weight of G.I. Joe, Retaliation. It's not absent, but it's inconsistent. The film reaches for intensity, but doesn't always hold on to it. It presents high stakes, but doesn't always ground them. It creates danger, but doesn't always make that danger felt. So in the end, you're left with a film where everything is at risk, but very little feels truly at stake. Because tension isn't just about scale, it's about connection. And without that connection, even the biggest threats can feel surprisingly light. At some point while watching G.I. Joe, Retaliation, a question starts to take shape, not whether the film is good, but whether it's enjoyable. And surprisingly, those two things don't always lead to the same answer, because this is a film that lives right in that divide. On one side, you have the issues, the thin plot, the uneven tone, the lack of cohesion. The moments where the story feels rushed, the characters underdeveloped, the logic stretched just a little too far. From a critical standpoint, those flaws are hard to ignore. They're visible, they're consistent, and they shape how the film is evaluated as a piece of storytelling. But then there's the other side, the experience, because despite those flaws, Retaliation has a way of staying watchable. It moves quickly, it delivers constant action. It doesn't demand too much from the viewer, and in doing so, it creates something that, while not deeply satisfying, is still easy to sit through. It becomes accessible, a film you can put on without needing to fully invest. A film that doesn't ask for analysis, doesn't slow down for reflection, and doesn't require you to follow every detail to stay engaged. It's built for immediacy, for moment-to-moment enjoyment rather than lasting impact. And for some viewers, that's exactly what they're looking for. There's a kind of guilty pleasure quality to it, the kind of experience where you recognize the flaws but choose to overlook them because the film still delivers something enjoyable in the moment. It doesn't challenge you, but it doesn't bore you either. It fills the space. It entertains just enough. But that's also where the limitation lies, because while the film can hold your attention, it rarely elevates itself beyond that level. It doesn't leave a strong impression. It doesn't offer much to reflect on. And once it's over, it tends to fade quickly, replaced by the next experience. It's not memorable, it's momentary, and that creates a very specific identity. This isn't a film that aims for depth. It's not trying to redefine its genre. It's not building towards something lasting. It's simply trying to work while you're watching it, and in that sense it succeeds depending on your expectations. If you're looking for structure, depth, and consistency, the flaws will stand out. If you're looking for movement, spectacle, and low-effort engagement, the film delivers just enough to satisfy. So the real question becomes, what do you value more? Because G.I. Joe, Retaliation doesn't fully succeed as a quality film, but it doesn't completely fail as an entertaining one either. It exists in that middle space. Not impressive enough to stand out, not weak enough to completely dismiss, just enough to pass the time, just enough to keep you watching. And sometimes, for a film like this, that's exactly what it's designed to do. When the action fades, when the noise settles, and the screen finally goes quiet, what stays with you? That's the question G.I. Joe, Retaliation leaves behind. Because while the film is constantly moving, constantly delivering spectacle, energy, and momentum, its lasting impact is far less certain. There are moments you remember, the mountain sequence, a few standout confrontations, certain visual beats that briefly rise above the rest, but beyond those isolated highlights, the film begins to blur. And that's where memorability becomes an issue, not because nothing happens, far from it. The film is packed with events, packed with action, packed with movement, but it rarely shapes those moments into something that lingers. They pass quickly, replaced by the next sequence, the next scene, the next escalation. And without that sense of build-up or reflection, those moments don't fully settle. They happen, but they don't stay. Cohesion plays a major role in that, because for a film to leave an impression, it needs to feel connected, not just in its events, but in its structure, its tone, its progression. Everything needs to work together, building towards something that feels complete. Here, that connection isn't always strong. The film moves from one thread to another, from one tone to the next, without always fully integrating those elements. The pieces are there, action, characters, ideas, but they don't always align into a unified whole. So instead of feeling like a single, continuous experience, it can feel like a collection of moments, some stronger than others, some more memorable than others, but not always tied together in a way that gives them lasting weight. And that affects how the film is remembered, because memorability isn't just about individual scenes, it's about how those scenes connect. How they build, how they leave a mark beyond their immediate impact. Without that cohesion, even strong moments can feel isolated. They stand out, but they don't carry the film with them. There's also a contrast in how different viewers respond. For some, the film has rewatch value, a kind of easy, accessible experience that you can return to without much effort. The kind of movie that works in the moment, even if it doesn't demand deeper engagement. For others, it leaves almost no impression at all. Once it ends, it fades, not in a negative way, but in a quiet, almost neutral way. Like something that passed through rather than something that stayed, and that duality defines its legacy. G.I. Joe, Retaliation isn't unforgettable, but it's not entirely forgettable either. It exists in between. A film with moments that stand out, but a whole that doesn't fully hold together. A story that moves quickly, but doesn't always leave a trace. an experience that engages while it's happening, but doesn't always extend beyond that. In the end, its impact isn't measured by what it builds, but by what remains after it's over. And here, what remains is selective. A few images, a few sequences, a few impressions, but not a lasting sense of something complete. Because while G.I. Joe, Retaliation gives you plenty to watch, it doesn't always give you something to remember. Behind every blockbuster like G.I. Joe, Retaliation, there's another story unfolding, one that doesn't happen on screen but shapes everything you see. The business, because this isn't just a film, it's a product of strategy, timing, and calculated decisions made long before the audience ever sits down to watch it. And Retaliation makes that especially clear. One of the most talked about aspects of the film wasn't even part of the story, it was its release. The decision to delay the film, to rework it for 3D, to shift its position in the market. On the surface, it was presented as a technical enhancement, a way to elevate the viewing experience. But the conversation around it suggested something more. Was it about improving the film or maximizing its commercial potential? Because in modern blockbuster filmmaking, those two things don't always align. The delay raised questions, not just about the format, but about the timing, the marketing, and even the role of star power within the film. There were discussions about whether certain elements needed to be adjusted, whether the film needed to be reshaped to better fit audience expectations. And that's where the business side becomes visible. Because decisions like these don't happen in isolation, they reflect how a studio views the film, not just as a story, but as an asset, something that needs to perform to justify its budget, to connect with as wide an audience as possible. And in that sense, Retaliation succeeds. Despite mixed reactions, despite criticism, the film performs. It finds its audience. It proves that spectacle, recognizable branding, and strategic positioning can carry a film forward even when the creative response is divided. The box office becomes its own kind of validation, not of quality, but of viability, and that distinction matters, because it highlights a recurring reality in this kind of filmmaking, the idea that success isn't always tied to critical reception. A film can be flawed, uneven, even widely criticized, and still achieve exactly what it was designed to achieve, which is to draw an audience, to generate revenue, to sustain a franchise. And that's where the commercial strategy becomes clear. This is a film built not just to tell a story, but to maintain a brand, to keep the franchise moving, to ensure that the name G.I. Joe remains active, visible, and marketable. Every decision, from casting changes to release timing, feeds into that larger goal. Even the structure of the film reflects it. Big action set pieces designed for trailers, recognizable faces added to broaden appeal. Moments crafted for maximum impact in short bursts. It's all part of a system where the film doesn't just exist as a piece of entertainment, but as a component within a larger commercial machine. And in that context, G.I. Joe, Retaliation does exactly what it's meant to do. It performs, it sustains, it keeps the franchise alive, but it also reveals something important. That sometimes the story behind the film, the decisions, the strategies, the calculations, can be just as telling as the story on the screen. Because in the end, Retaliation isn't just about what happens within the film. It's about what happens around it, and how those choices shape not just the movie you watch, but the reason it exists in the first place. Before G.I. Joe, Retaliation even reached audiences, it had already become part of a different kind of conversation, not about the story, but about the version of the film itself. Because this wasn't just a standard release, it was a delayed release, a modified release, a film reshaped after it was already complete. The decision to pull the movie from its original schedule and convert it into 3D instantly shifted attention away from the film and onto the strategy behind it. On paper, it was framed as an upgrade, an enhancement designed to give audiences a more immersive experience. But the reaction to that decision was divided, because for many, it raised a simple question: was this about improving the film or improving its commercial potential? 3D, by this point, had become more than just a format. It was a business tool, a way to increase ticket prices, to create an event, to make a film feel bigger, even if the content itself hadn't changed. And Retaliation found itself right in the middle of that shift. The conversion itself became part of the film's identity, not something that was built into the original vision, but something added afterward. And that distinction matters, because it changes how the audience experiences it. Instead of feeling organic, the 3D presentation can feel layered on top, an extra dimension that doesn't always align with how the film was originally shot or structured. For some viewers, it doesn't add much. The action is already large. The scale is already present. The spectacle exists without needing that additional layer, so the 3D becomes less of an enhancement and more of a novelty, something that's there but not essential. At the same time, the delay itself becomes part of the narrative. The film disappears, then returns. The conversation builds, then shifts. Speculation grows about what changed, what was added, what was adjusted. Was it purely technical? Were there other reasons behind the scenes? Did the film evolve during that gap? Those questions linger, even if the answers remain unclear. Then there's the idea of alternate versions, extended cuts, different formats. Slight variations that promise a more complete or slightly altered experience. But in reality, those differences tend to be subtle. They add small details, minor expansions, enough to give the sense of something new, but not enough to fundamentally change the film itself. So what you're left with is a movie that exists in multiple forms, but remains essentially the same at its core. And that's what defines this aspect of G.I. Joe, Retaliation. The film isn't just shaped by what's in it, it's shaped by how it's presented, the format, the timing, the version you watch. All of it becomes part of the experience. But in the end, those layers don't redefine the film, they surround it. Because whether you watch it in 3D or not, whether you see the theatrical version or an extended cut, the core remains unchanged. The action is the same, the structure is the same, the experience is the same. Which raises one final thought. Sometimes, the biggest changes happen around a film without ever truly changing the film itself. At a certain point, while watching G.I. Joe, Retaliation, it becomes clear this isn't just a movie. It's a brand in motion. Because unlike many action films that begin as stories and expand into franchises, G.I. Joe works in the opposite direction. It starts as a product, a toy line. A concept built around characters, designs, and market appeal, and then becomes a film. And you can feel that foundation in almost every frame. The structure, the characters, even the way the story unfolds. It all carries the imprint of something that exists beyond the screen. This isn't just about narrative progression. It's about representation. About bringing recognizable figures, roles, and identities to life in a way that aligns with something much larger, the franchise itself. And that creates a very specific kind of storytelling. Characters are introduced with clarity and purpose, but not always with depth. They feel defined, instantly recognizable, almost as if they come with built-in identities. Like they were designed to be understood quickly rather than explored over time, because in many ways they were. There's a simplicity to it, a directness. Each character fits into a role, a function, a visual and conceptual space that makes sense immediately. Leader, specialist, rival, villain. The framework is clean, efficient, and easy to follow. But that efficiency comes at a cost. Because when characters are built as icons first and individuals second, the narrative starts to reflect that. The story becomes less about development and more about placement, moving these figures through situations that highlight what they are, rather than who they could become. And that extends beyond the characters. The action itself often feels designed around visual appeal, distinct looks, unique weapons, set pieces that emphasize style and identity, moments that don't just serve the story, but feel like they could exist as standalone pieces within a larger system of recognition. It's cinematic but also collectible. You can almost see the blueprint behind it, a world constructed not just for storytelling, but for expansion, for continuation. For adaptation across different forms, film, merchandise, media, everything is built to be part of something bigger than a single narrative, and that awareness shapes how the film operates. It doesn't aim for complexity. It doesn't aim for subtlety. It aims for clarity, visibility, immediate impact, because in a brand-driven system, those are the priorities. The film knows what it represents. It leans into its identity as a large-scale, accessible action property. It embraces the idea that it's part of a broader ecosystem, one where recognition and familiarity matter just as much as storytelling. And for some viewers that works. There's a certain appeal in that simplicity, in the way the film doesn't overcomplicate itself. It delivers exactly what it promises: action, characters, spectacle, without asking for more. But for others, that same structure can feel limiting, because when everything is designed to fit within a brand, the space for originality, for depth, for deviation becomes smaller. The film doesn't break out of its framework, it operates within it. And that's what defines G.I. Joe, Retaliation at its core. It's not just telling a story, it's maintaining an identity, sustaining a brand, keeping a system in motion. A system where the film is one piece of a much larger machine, and once you see it that way, everything starts to make sense. The choices, the structure, the priorities, because this isn't just about what happens on screen. It's about what the film represents beyond it, a franchise built not just to be watched, but to exist, expand, and endure as something bigger than the story itself. By the time G.I. Joe, Retaliation reaches its final moments, there's an unspoken question left hanging in the air: where does this go next? Because this isn't just an ending, it's a pause a point where the film wraps up its immediate conflict, but leaves the door open just enough to suggest that the story isn't necessarily over. And in a franchise like this, built on scale, built on continuity, built on expansion, that possibility always lingers. But here's where things become uncertain, because the future of this franchise doesn't feel driven by the story itself. It feels driven by something else: performance, reception, momentum. On one hand, the film proves that the franchise still has life. It delivers spectacle, it attracts an audience, and it maintains enough visibility to justify continuation. From a commercial perspective, the path forward exists. The foundation is still there, but from a creative standpoint, the direction isn't as clear, because Retaliation doesn't end with a strong narrative pull toward the next chapter. It doesn't build a compelling thread that demands continuation. Instead, it leaves things in a state that allows for another film, but doesn't necessarily require one, and that distinction matters. Because a sequel driven by necessity feels different from one driven by opportunity. Here, it feels like opportunity. The world is still open. The characters are still in place. The conflict could continue, but the urgency isn't fully there. And that creates a mixed response. For some viewers, the idea of another installment holds a certain appeal. There's familiarity in the formula, a curiosity about where the story could go, and a willingness to return for another round of action and spectacle. Even if the previous film didn't fully deliver, the potential for improvement still exists. But for others, the question is more direct. Why continue? If the film doesn't leave a strong impression, if it doesn't build towards something bigger, if it doesn't fully establish its identity, then what would the next chapter offer that this one didn't? And that uncertainty defines the franchise at this point. It's not at an endpoint, but it's not at a clear beginning either. It's in between, a series that has momentum but not direction. A brand that has recognition, but not a fully realized path forward. And ultimately, the decision to continue doesn't rest on the story. It rests on whether the franchise still works, whether the audience is still there, whether the formula still holds, whether the name still carries weight. Because in the world of G.I. Joe, continuation isn't just about narrative resolution, it's about viability. So as Retaliation closes, it doesn't demand a sequel, it suggests one. And whether that suggestion becomes reality depends on everything happening beyond the screen. Because sometimes the future of a franchise isn't written in its ending, it's decided after it. And that's the core of it. G.I. Joe, Retaliation isn't lacking characters, it's lacking connection to those characters. Because in the end, engagement isn't just about being present in the story. It's about feeling something when that story unfolds. And here, that feeling comes and goes, never quite strong enough to define the experience, but never completely absent either.